Okay, so here we
That's
have
what I
the setup for the
expected.
first method that we'll be using. It's called the A-star pathfinding script or setup or whatever. But either way, this is something that you can find online and import into your project. And it's really helpful in a wide array of things. What we're going to be using it for today, it's going to seem like it's quite limited. However, in the future, we may be able to use this again and use a little bit more of its potential. So beginning with how you'll set this up, go online, find A-star pathfinding. I'll leave a link in the description below. And you're gonna import this package. You're just gonna download it, the free version, because there's two versions. There's like a professional version and there's a free version. You're gonna download the free version because that's what we're using here and it's sufficient for what we need. And then you're gonna import that package. Once you've imported that package, it's gonna sit in your assets folder or somewhere down here in your project files. And you'll be able to follow along with what we're gonna do right here. Now I've already got everything set up, and that's because it's a bit finicky what we'll be doing, and I didn't want to be fiddling around as I'm trying to do this tutorial, just because I thought might as well just save some time. But I'm going to walk through some of the steps so no one's lost on this. Alright, first thing we'll do is we go into our hierarchy and then we create an empty game object. Right click to do that, and then we go to this cog over here. We're going to reset every bit of its transform. And then we're going to add a component. Now I've typed in path here, and this is the Pathfinder script. This Pathfinder script is going to give us a ton of menus here, and it's really convenient how it's all set up. It's all automated. You don't have to script or code anything, and that's the brilliant part about using this pathfinding script. We don't really have to jump into our scripts ourselves. Now, you're going to see a menu here and it says add new graph. You're also going to see at the bottom left of my screen it says you shouldn't have to A stars, blah, 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 blah. Anyway, I'm going to deal with that. That's just because I've already got it in my project. But you're going to click on grid graph where it says add new graph, and that's going to produce a graph. Now if I do it here, it's just going to mess up my project a little bit, so I'll show you what that looks like. Okay, so this is the graph that I created earlier, and I'm just going to go right the way down all of these settings and just walk us through so that we're on the same page. So grid graph, we want the shape to be a grid. We don't want isometric, hexagonal, advanced, or whatever like that. The position is reset as we've done before, and we're going to set it to 2D because we're working in 2D with Unity. Now, another thing you're going to want to do is toggle gizmos so that they're on, because you can see otherwise I can't actually see my grid. When I have my gizmos on, I can see my grid down there. Connections, cut corners, all those things, we're going to leave those. And then where it says use 2D physics, we're going to check that. That's going to be unchecked for you, but we're going to check that. Collision testing, all that stuff, we can leave. Now we should have a name assigned to our ground layer, and for me that's main ground. Now this is an obstacle layer mask. This means that it's going to use that layer to see where our obstacles are. And I'm saying, you know, our obstacles are our ground features. You can't just like slide on through this hill over here. You have to stop. That's an obstacle for our player, and it should be an obstacle for our enemy. Where you see obstacle layer mask, you find the name of your ground component, and that's whatever was attached to your grid. So I look at the child here, main ground, and the layer is main ground. Once you have that done, you should be good to go. Now you can change the size of your nodes, you can change the collider type. So we have circle colliders here, you can make them points. I haven't really experimented with that so much, but as we change the diameter, our graph will scan in a different way. Now if you want to see where your enemy will be able to navigate, what you do is you hit scan, and that's the reason why I've been saying scan so much. And here you're going to see the blue parts are where our enemy's going to be able to move, and the red parts are where our enemy's going to be blocked. You can see sometimes it's a bit finicky, and that's what I didn't want to play around with, because there's a blue part in the middle of here. It doesn't really matter because it's being blocked off by these red parts here. Okay, so what do we do in terms of our melee enemy? This is a part that I can really just walk you through. So I'm just gonna delete this whole thing here and say I've just created another empty game object. We have this one from before. I'm gonna call this enemy on path. And then we're just gonna go to wherever our characters are, wherever the sprites are for our characters. Just get a visual representation. We're just gonna take something out and that's gonna access the sprite renderer for us. We're gonna make that a child of enemy on path. And with this, we're going to go to add component, and then we're going to find rigid body 2D. We're going to leave it at dynamic and all of these settings. We're going to freeze the rotation on the Z axis, otherwise our character here is going to start flipping around and going crazy. And then I'm going to go to add component, collider 2D. So we're going to go for a circle collider. And I'm pretty comfortable with leaving it as it is. As you can see here, it wraps around quite nicely around our enemy over there. So it's a good representation of the space that they'll be taking up. And there we have it for that. Now we're going to go back to enemy on path. We're going to go add component, AI, path. We're going to go for this script, AI path 2D, 3D. Draw gizmos, yep, that's all good. The radius, you can see that we've got this weird box on top of our thing. So the orientation we're going to want to use is going to be along the Y axis, and so now we don't have that big square because it's not trying to generate an orientation for a 3D game but rather a 2D game, which we are creating. And then the radius, so this is going to control the size of our character. We're just going to increase the radius to about that much. Doesn't really matter if I say the exact number. You're going to have different kinds of enemies in your project if you're using your own assets, and you'll have to adjust that according. But I just want this to wrap around just a little bit like a collider would. I'm not satisfied with that max speed, so I'm going to set that to 5. Otherwise we're going to be crawling. I'm going to leave gravity to use project settings, and I'm going to disable rotation. And finally we're going to go to add component again. I'm going to type in DES to get destination set up. Because we need a destination, we need to tell our enemy game object what to actually pursue, and that's going to be our tutorial player. So I'm just going to put our tutorial player in there, and there we have it. That should be set up quite nicely. We'll hit play and see if we've encountered any issues. Okay, so as you can see, our enemy is crawling along the ground. Now what would have happened is if we assign the rigid body and the collider to the parent game object, which is what we'd usually do, you'd have it where it would be quite floaty. It wouldn't seem like it was traveling along the floor, kind of like our player game object here, and that is not something that we want. We want it to look like it's pursuing us in the same way that we move around. So you can see that it's actually pursuing us. Once it gets to us, it stops. It's a bit finicky, it's a bit fidgety, but essentially it's working as it should. And we can assign this to an enemy that's going to melee us, something that's going to pursue us, maybe explode on impact. I recommend using this kind of method for an enemy that does a lot of high damage and that you just want in an isolated area. So something that might, 1 or 2 shot you, as opposed to something a little bit more agile, which we'll be exploring in the next part. Okay, so our second method is something I'm a little bit more excited about, just because it's something I had a little bit more involvement in, a little bit more hands-on time with. So we're going to take, our game object again. In fact, I'm just going to take another sprite just to mix things up a little bit. And so here we have our melee pursuit enemy game object. And similar to what we did before, we're going to go to add component. I'm going to go rigid body, 2D. I'm going to freeze that rotation. I'm going to go add component again, collider 2D, circle collider. That's what we're going to need. Now that we've got that set up, we're good to add a script to our game object. So we can go to add component, new script. Or I can cheat and go to add component. I already did this before. So here we are in Visual Studio. You'll probably see just half of the script because I probably blurred out the second bit in post. Now the first half is dealing with the basic movement of our character here. So we start off in Void Awake. And here we just, make a reference to the rigid body. So melee enemy equals rigid body. That means that we don't have to mess around with that too much when we need to use it later. Then we go to void update, and we have player game object equals find object with tag player. So it's very straightforward, very simple. We're going to make a reference to an object that is tagged player. And now if we haven't already done so, we can try to make sure that our player game object is actually tagged player. Now you can do that by going to add tag. Maybe you've already got a tag that says player here, or whatever you want to put in. Just make sure that it matches the script. And then we'll go to move direction, and the direction that we're going to move in is going to be the position of our player game object minus the position of the object that this script is actually attached to, which is our melee enemy. Now you probably remember this is very similar to our tracker bullet. However, with our tracker bullet script, we did this in void start. At the instance that this object was instantiated into the scene, it would go in the direction of our player game object. However, this time we're going to be continually updating that. And then we go to melee enemy dot velocity equals new vector 2. So I've made a reference to move direction, and we're going to just do this along the x-axis. And then with the y-axis, we're just going to go get component rigid body 2D velocity dot y. If we just left it at 0f, because we're not actually using the y-axis, we'd get a lot of floaty movement from our enemy game object, which is really frustrating and really not good looking. So just by getting that rigid body there on the y-axis, we're able to have a good arc for something that we're going to do a little bit later. I'll just demonstrate to you what this script does. Alright, quick demo of the script. It's exactly the same as the other one. I actually prefer the movement on this one because it's still a little less floaty than what we had before. We did some changes on how we set up our A-star pathfinding method. However, when it got to the edges, you could see that there was a definite barrier that it was just sort of not colliding with properly. In this way, it seems a little bit more in tune with how our player actually moves. When they hit something, they hit it pretty hard. They don't float around or anything like that. So it keeps the pace of the game a little bit more consistent. Now that's all good and well, but I'm, moving at a pretty fast speed, and as soon as I can get an obstacle between me and my enemy, there's no risk. I can just shoot them. This one's not going to die because I haven't set it up yet. I can shoot them. I can cheese the game essentially. So how do we make it a little bit more harder for our players, and how do we make it a little bit more dynamic? Well, the answer is very simple. We use jumps. Now back into Visual Studio, I've revealed what I was hiding from before. And it says void on trigger, enter 2D, collider, 2D. So once we enter a collider 2D with a tag, and then we're going to make a case for it, spring, that means that we're going to add a particular force to our enemy. And that force is a vector 2 up by a force of 600, or a vector 2 up by a force of 800. Now this is why we didn't really touch anything here in terms of the y-axis, because we wanted that to be affected in a different way. We wanted our enemy to be able to jump, not to just float up to our player game object, because that's just another floating enemy which we can create in the A-star pathfinding method, or we can do it here, but that's not what we're going for today. We're going for something that can pursue us, that can jump, that can give us a little bit of a threat, that can be hot on our heels. So again, the references are made, and we can attach these tags to different objects. So you saw that I had 2 heights of obstacles in our game. Now our player can very easily navigate that because their jump is such that they can go over just about 2 units of obstacles. And this first bit allows us to go over 1 unit, and the second bit allows us to go over 2 units. The force is greater in the second one, so obviously that's what we're doing. And just to make sure that we don't have any confusion, we've labeled it big spring and spring. So spring can usually take about 1 unit, big spring can take 2, and you know, if we really wanted to, we can make an even bigger spring and it can take up 3 units, jump even higher than our player game object. But we're not going to do that right now. What I'm going to do is demonstrate how you can implement these springs into your game. So back in our scene view, we go to the hierarchy, create empty. I'm going to make a tag. If I don't have the tags already, I go to add tag. However, I do have the tags, and it's going to be called spring. Now, it's not going to be very useful to us if we don't have a collider. So I'm going to get circle collider 2D because it triggers when it enters that collider. And I'm going to set this to is trigger so it's not just going to bump against it and do nothing. So we can see that our collider is positioned about there. And then if I play the game, you can see that our game object actually has super hops. Alright, by the power of prefabs, I was able to figure out what actually went wrong. So initially I set the gravity scale to 5, which gives us a faster jump arc for our enemy game object here, which I'm going to demonstrate. I'm just going to add in the rest of the springs, and while we're at it, we might as well name these springs. So I'll just call this spring, and then we can make a duplicate game object, move it over here so it can come back to pursue us later, and then we're going to go create empty game object, follow this big spring, and then tag it according. And then with big spring, we're gonna get that circle collider 2D again, set that to is trigger. We're gonna position that just about here. I'm gonna move my enemy so that they don't jump as soon as they're in the scene. We're gonna duplicate this big spring again, and then we're gonna move it over to this side. And now let's play and see what happens. Okay, so it jumped anyway, but you can see it's able to get over that initial ledge. It's able to get over that. Jumps a couple of times. Jumps over there. There we go. Some nice fluid jumps there and there. And so it can be a little finicky, just with how we place the springs and everything. But the end result is that we have an enemy that can pursue us with different kinds of terrains. We can cheese it out a little bit, as you saw there. If I stand on the ledge and it jumps after me, it's just going to jump straight up just because of how it's actually following us. The closer we get, the slower it moves. And so that's something that we can change a little bit later. But all in all, I'm pretty satisfied with what we have going here, even though I'm getting ultra frustrated by the fact that it just doesn't want to make this jump. But we can change that. We can manipulate that a little bit when we go back into the scene view, bring this spring a little bit closer, things like that. But this has been a demonstration of how you can make your melee enemies move in your run and gun side-scrolling game. But as always, guys, thanks for sticking around, thanks for watching this tutorial. If you have any feedback, leave that in the comments. If you have any questions or anything, maybe I missed something, just let me know, because with the amount of struggle that goes into making these videos, I'm sure I can help you fix your own errors that you might encounter, because they're probably going to be the same ones that I encounter when I try to set this stuff up. But either way, guys, thank you so much. This has been another press any button tutorial. If you want to subscribe, do so. We got an onslaught of videos coming, and I will see you very soon.